Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Anti Naughty Podcast. I am your host, Eric Jones, and today we're going to be talking about a topic that it means quite a lot to me, and it's really what got me into doing all of this work that I do now, and that is September 11th. And I'm very proud to introduce the guest that we have today, which is Richard Gage, AIA, and he is a 30-year San Francisco Bay Area architect and a member of the American Institute of Architects, and he is the founding member of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Mr. Gage became interested in researching the destruction of the World Trade Center high rises after hearing the startling conclusions of a reluctant 9/11 researcher named David Ray Griffin on the radio in 2006, which launched his own unyielding quest for truth about 9/11. Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth now numbers more than 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center high-rise buildings on 9/11. Richard, welcome to the Anti-Naughty. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Eric. Great to be here.
Yeah, this is exciting to talk to you. So before we jump into looking at at the event itself, though, I'd like to just get to know you a little bit more. Can you tell us about a little bit about your career as an architect before you got into creating this organization?
I worked for a number of different architecture firms over the 20-year period before I became aware of the truth about what really happened on 9/11. I worked in commercial early on, in residential. The last half of my career has been commercial and institutional work, such as libraries, animal shelters. The last project was a large one in Las Vegas with uh, 400 million square feet of retail office space and mid-rise office building and a parking structure, a huge 6-block retail center near Las Vegas.
Mm-hmm.
And altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. Worked on a number of schools prior to that, high schools in a Walnut Creek architecture firm too. So I had a great career with lots of experience.
Excellent. And I think that's a big part of what makes your organization so interesting is all the real life experience that you and others bring to the table. Um, so can you tell us a little bit more about how you started to question the official story? We mentioned that radio interview that you heard, but what were the details that really caught your attention that made you question things?
Well, there wasn't anything prior to that radio interview. I mean, not a stitch did I hear about an alternative uh, evidence set that has uh, caused me to question. But on that particular day, this interview with David Ray Griffin was focused on the oral histories of the first responders that was
Mm-hmm.
recorded by Thomas von Essen of his 500 first responders, uh, within a month after 9/11, because he wanted to collect these recordings before a collective memory reshaped, uh, uh, before their individual memories were reshaped by a collective memory, as he puts it. Anyway, we didn't know about these recordings or what they said until the New York Court State of Appeals forced the city to release this information, and the transcripts were finally published uh, uh, on the New York Times. And
Mm-hmm.
they finally, we, I was just shocked to hear everything that they were saying, which was sounds of explosions before the towers ever collapsed. Hundreds of these first responders seeing flashes of light, many of them, like a belt, they said, exploding all the way around the towers. All these explosions and they're being blown around in the buildings as well. They're everybody they're saying thought these buildings um, were set with explosives. One of them said pop, 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 like firecrackers all the way down the building, just like when you detonate a building. Um, that's what I saw. So this is I'm going. What? The explosions are not a part of the official story whatsoever. So this was a big part of it. And then David Ray Griffin was talking also about a third skyscraper that collapsed, uh, Building 7, straight down into its own footprint in under 7 seconds. I'm going, what? 47-story skyscraper collapses symmetrically at free fall, um, uh, as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky? I mean, I would have heard about this. I'm an architect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So after starting to hear these things and question things, how did you then eventually get to the point of deciding, well, to dedicate so much of your time and your life to uh, finding the true story? Well, how did you get to that point?
Well, if the evidence that we're going to be talking about today is convincing and clear and irrefutable evidence for the explosive demolition of all three of these buildings. We have the evidence of incendiary and high explosives as the cause of these buildings' collapse,
Mm-hmm.
not jet fuel fires or jet planes. So we uh, the implications are that somebody other than 19 fundamentalist hijackers got into these buildings in the months before 9/11 and set them. The implications of that are that they deceived the security of three of the most highly secure buildings outside the Pentagon. Uh, this has been covered up by the media, and so because the media didn't cover any of this evidence that we're going to be talking about today. So
Mm-hmm.
this implies obviously a vast and deep and powerful uh, mafia type operation that exceeds anything I could have imagined before, and and that woke me up to realize that things are not as they are, as I thought they were in our society, in our government, in our media, in our even our elected or representatives who have ignored all of this evidence as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I got mad, angry.
Yeah. But I would say there's a lot of people who are angry, but not everyone goes out and dedicates so much of their life to doing this. It has. Have you had a drive for justice for a long time in your life?
No, I've never been an activist before, but this is a lie that I can't live with. If we're being deceived on a mass scale such that two major countries, we've killed 2 million people in these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, we've lost civil liberties as a result of these attacks, particularly on the Twin Towers, and uh, through the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. We have spent $6.5 trillion on this global war on terror, and it's continuing. It doesn't have an end. I mean, who wouldn't dedicate their lives to try to expose this?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel the same, and it's exactly why I've been driven into this field of work myself. Um, so we do have limited time today, so I'd like to just jump right into the evidence, and we've got a lot of new stuff that's come out recently with a new study that has happened with at the University of Fairbanks or University of Alaska Fairbanks. And can you tell us about what this study was?
Yes, the third tower that we mentioned that I didn't even know about is a 47-story skyscraper that collapsed at 5:20 in the afternoon into its own footprint. And this is after witnesses hear explosions. So we're told 7 years later by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked with explaining all three collapses to the American people, that this building came down due to normal office fires. Well, we have never had a skyscraper collapse due to office fires before. So we for years, 12 years now, we have been telling everybody about it. The the media, the elected officials, uh, other government officials, and the public. And we got bold and raised $300,000 in an effort to get a real scientific study that NIST says they did, but failed miserably because what Professor Leroy Halsey from University of Alaska Fairbanks found in this during the last 4 years of this recently released study is that fire could not have brought this building down, and that the assumptions that NIST made in their computer modeling, which they say proved their effort, is that not only fire could not have brought this building down, but that at least a dozen of the key assumptions that NIST made were false assumptions. And
Mhm.
there were key structural components that were missing. And so, uh, even though with all those false assumptions, the the more extensive study by uh, the University of Alaska found that the building would not have fallen. And so then they say, well, gosh, how do we get this building to fail? Well, they take out 6 columns instead of just one. There wouldn't have been a progressive collapse, is the finding of the Alaska study here.
Mhm.
So they take out 6 columns, and the building does finally begin to fail, but it tips over like you would expect. Well, how do we get this building to collapse in the exact manner that the videos show that it collapses, which is straight down, uniformly, symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds at free fall acceleration, in the exact manner, by the way, as a classic controlled demolition. You can't tell the difference between these building 7 standing next to a series of videos of controlled demolition. I encourage your listeners to just go on YouTube and search Building 7 collapse. Looks like exactly like the old hotels in Las Vegas. Well, how do we get it to collapse? Professor Halsey says. Well, uh, so he and his team of PhD researchers uh, had to take out all 650 columns over an 8-story section of this building, and then by God, it collapses in the exact manner as
Mhm.
we saw in the videos of the buildings collapse. So, what can do that is the question, and of course, only explosives can do that. And so we have the evidence of both incendiaries and explosives.
So can you tell us uh, how would a regular controlled demolition work? Would you be taking out all of these support systems at once in a controlled demolition?
Yes, you have to place hundreds of shaped cutter charges at key locations in the columns and beams in the building, and that releases all of the power, the the capacity to hold weight that they had. So uh, when that happens, the building comes down in the manner that they design it to come down. If they want it to come down straight and do its own footprint, they can do exactly that. So that's how they do it. And there's a dozen companies in the U.S. that are quite capable of doing that.
Mm-hmm.
The largest controlled demolition was the Hudson building, and was that Chicago? Yeah, Chicago. And this was much larger than that. Uh, Interestingly enough, NIST said, well, that couldn't have been a controlled demolition because um, you would have heard all kinds of explosions. Well, there were all kinds of explosions heard by witnesses prior to this building's collapse. Uh, and we also have the evidence of pools of molten iron, which is a different kind of incendiary, which is an incendiary uh, with the evidence found of thermite in the building. Well, thermite is an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. And there are patented cutter charges, which are much more effective than high energy explosives that are typically used in controlled demolitions. They issue molten iron in hot streams in milliseconds. And molten iron, interestingly enough, was what was found by FEMA early on in their investigation, published in Appendix C of their report in May of 2002 in the Building Performance Assessment Report. So they find hot sulfur corrosion attack on the steel with liquid molten iron. Well, how does that happen? Well, thermite issues molten iron at 4,000 degrees, and that those temperatures can't possibly be explained by normal office fires, or by the way, by jet fuel, which is only a hydrocarbon. It burns only as hot as um, desks or chairs. In the case of the Twin Towers, which were hit by planes, Building 7 was not hit by a plane. And so it had particularly, it was particularly an interesting case to study for the University of Alaska, uh, because because uh, nobody died in that building. It's it's one that we can present to people that, and most people don't even know about it. Most architects and engineers don't even know about the third worst structural failure in modern history. So we can talk about it uh, without the ego that gets involved when you talk about the collapse of the Twin Towers,
Mm-hmm.
because the towers, you had all this traumatic loss of life. People are put in shock, and then you have airplanes, which add to the mix of the technical problem of getting to what really brought this building down.
Mm-hmm.
These buildings.
So you said earlier that no building has ever collapsed due to office fires.
No skyscraper.
It's interesting. And I'm also glad you brought up the molten metal because that it's become a common like meme, a joke on the internet that jet fuel can't melt steel beams, but it seems like a total misunderstanding of the important issue, which is it's not even about the weakening of the steel and whether or not that's possible. It's about the fact that yes, molten iron was found. We had molten metal, and that seems to signify explosive. Some sort of explosives were used,
Well, it signifies that there are incendiaries used.
or
Uh,
incendiary. Yep.
in the thermite incendiary issues streams of molten iron. And so this is what is found. These meteorites, they called them, fused molten iron uh, uh, that they'd pull up by the ton down here. Molten concrete, too, by the way, which I don't even know can melt. It's 3,200 degrees concrete melts, and it's found wrapping itself around, for instance, in this museum, the police museum in New York today. You can go see this piece of molten concrete wrapping around a handgun that they pulled out of building 6. And so how do you get 3,200 degree temperatures? Well, again, thermite is the only thing that explains this phenomenon. And the molten iron, it takes 2,800 degrees to melt iron or steel. And you're correct. The official story only says that the fires weakened the steel. At 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, steel can it reaches half of it loses half of its strength at about that temperature and can begin to bend. So the official story denies the evidence of molten materials in the NIST report, but that's because they threw out the evidence that FEMA had created and documented very carefully in that earlier 2002 report. In fact, the author of that report, Jonathan Barnett, fire protection engineer, says that the ends of the steel beams were partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures.
Hmm. The metal itself evaporated?
It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel.
Huh.
So where do those temperatures come from? And where do the temperatures come from to create all of these molten iron spheres that are documented by the U.S. Geological Survey? Up to 6% of some of these samples of the dust, the powdered concrete that was all throughout lower Manhattan in a 3 square mile area, this dust in a blanket 3 inches thick, up to 6% of that material was molten iron microspheres, almost naked to the human eye in size. But they document them very carefully. It's iron, it's not molten steel. Where does 10 tons, which we can figure out by extrapolation, of molten iron microspheres come from? Well, no, it's not. It's not before the event from iron workers. It's not after the event by iron workers. I mean, during construction by iron workers, before or after by iron workers cleaning up and cutting up the steel. No, these are found far away on the Brooklyn Bridge as well. In fact, the EPA says these are a signature component of the World Trade Center dust. It's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these unidentified, previously molten iron microspheres. In other words, they don't even know where they came from. Well, R.J. Lee, an independent environmental consulting firm, does toxicological studies on the dust, and they find that these are formed during the event, not before, not after. Well, again, it takes 2,800 degrees to melt iron. So jet fuel didn't do it. What did it? Where did it come from? It's got sulfur corrosion in it, according to FEMA. Well, where did the sulfur come from? Well, sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate. Cuts much more effectively through steel.
Mm-hmm. So what you said that we have evidence of the thermite. Is the sulfur the key thing that points to that, or is there other scientific analysis that points to the thermite?
Thermite releases molten iron. The sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, a different form of thermate. And so that's evidence of thermate, the sulfur is. What's evidence of thermite is the molten, the iron, the fact that it's iron. The fact that it's molten is also evidence of thermite. So those are not created by other processes in these quantities and at these temperatures.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And another interesting aspect of Building 7 that you mentioned was it was said to have collapsed at free fall for at least part of its collapse. And I believe NIST changed their documentation, their official story on that. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, at first NIST was denying that the building came down at free fall. And in their analysis, they actually zoomed in on a pixel that began to move 5 seconds earlier than the building collapsed. So they averaged that out and could show that it wasn't an absolute free fall. Later, it was pointed out to them publicly, and they were quite embarrassed to be told publicly that this is easily measurable by anybody with a with software these days. So
Mm-hmm.
they admitted in their final report that it did come down at free fall, but they simply said that this is consistent with their earlier uh, studies, which it wasn't, A, and B, even if it was, what does free fall mean? Well, they acknowledged that the building came down for a third of its 7-second fall at free fall. That means for at least 100 feet of distance in which this fell, there was absolutely no resistance, not from one column of the 82 columns on at least 8 floors over 100 feet gave any resistance. So where did those columns go is the question that they didn't ask or answer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the University of Alaska study was that was that looking at all of these different aspects, or it was specifically focused? Uh, how was that study focused? I guess that's my question.
The study focused on what caused the collapse of this building. So they modeled in SAP 2000 and Abacus software, very powerful modeling software, the capability of the columns and beam connections in this building and the floor slabs to resist a collapse, uh, given the same degree of fires that the NIST uh, organization had modeled with the same structure that the NIST modeled, and they found that it didn't collapse. So one of the key points here is one of the things they found is that NIST uh, artificially uh, caused the exterior wall to be infinitely stiff, which then, with the expansion of the floor and beam system on the above the 12th floor, um, pushed toward the inside this girder on this column 79, uh, pushing it off of its seat. And they say then that floor 13 fell on 12 and 12 on 11 and so on for 9 floors. And then this column 79 buckled. And that caused the failure of almost 30 floors above it, and then the east penthouse being the first exterior portion of the collapse, which was 6 seconds earlier than the overall collapse. Well, then they say this interior collapse traveled laterally across the building in 10 seconds or so, and then the whole building came down. Well, none of that could be true for a whole variety of reasons, some of which we knew, some of which were discovered by the University of Alaska. So, for instance, they had to omit key structural elements such as stiffeners at the end of the girder, which would have kept its bottom flange from ever folding, uh, which is key to NIST's collapse theory,
Mm-hmm.
as the beam was scooted off of its seat on column 79. They also had to omit the shear studs, which tied that girder to the slab up above it, uh, so it couldn't have slid sideways at all. They also omitted the side plate on this building, which would have trapped that girder as it moved sideways after expanding uh, due to the heat of the fire. Th- these they also had to put all of the heat into the beams in a second and a half, forcing them to expand rather than uh, sag, which they would have done under normal conditions. Um, and they also didn't have fireproofing on the beam, so they never would have sagged. It's just a comedy of errors, is one way to put it. A sea of fraud is more accurate, though.
Mhm.
And this is what. Uh, but even with all of those errors in, the University of Alaska couldn't start a progressive collapse. So their conclusion is that this didn't happen by fire or a progressive collapse. It could only have happened if all the columns uh, on over 8 floors were removed near simultaneously.
Mhm. Yeah, so we have a real in-depth study showing us scientifically all the issues with the official explanation. And has this study gotten much of a response from the academic community or politicians or anyone?
Well, we're in the open comment period now, and so we have a repository of deposited comments, which we'll be going through this week and next week and the week after. So there are lots of comments that have come in. I don't know if they are from the academic community yet or not, but we've received lots of supportive comments from
Mhm.
the very well trained engineers, structural engineers in the 9/11 Truth community.
Excellent. Um,
The final
well,
report will be issued by the end of the year.
excellent, excellent. Something we can definitely look forward to. Um, and so let's jump into the Twin Towers themselves, though. Talk about that a bit. Can you tell us a little bit about the structure of the Twin Towers? How,
Sure. We have an external exoskeleton, which was a new invention in skyscraper uh, structural engineering uh, in the 60s here, because up until that time you just had a forest of columns all throughout the building, really impacting the ability of designers to lay out offices in these buildings. But here they grouped 47 core columns tightly around and around the elevator shafts, and that left 60 feet on one side, 35 feet on two other sides of open office planning. And so the rest of the columns were all pushed to the outside in this exoskeleton with these Varandeel truss elements of 3 vertical and 3 horizontal pieces that were welded together and then brought out to the site and erected and bolted one on top of the other all the way up the building with a hat truss tying these two major structural components together at the very top. And then
Mhm.
between the interior core column set and the perimeter column set, you had these lightweight steel trusses, which span again 60 feet and 35 feet, and acting as the horizontal diaphragm to tie these together at every floor.
And so was when they were constructing these towers, did they think about the possibility of a plane crashing into it? Were they prepared for something like that?
Well, John Skilling, the chief structural engineer, uh, before he died and passed that baton on to Leslie Robertson, said that it was designed to have two. I don't know why he said this, but he did two 707s, the largest aircraft at the time, hitting it. He said the problem would be that the jet fuel would dump into the building, but this building would still be there. That's a quote from him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So they were specifically made to withstand impacts like this. Um, and we do have quotes from people like Bush and Condoleezza Rice, suggesting that no one had ever considered such a possibility. So I always found that interesting.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of contradictions to that claim. But regarding the exterior skeleton, we're talking about if you saw the hole, you could see how small it is in the side of the building before it collapsed. It's a minor um, uh, it's minor damage to the building that in and of itself, even as acknowledged by NIST, they say that the building was quite robust and it held up just fine after the impacts. What they fault is the fires, which were started by the jet fuel. But the jet fuel, 90% of it burned up outside the building, and the rest of it was gone in 10 minutes. It simply started a fire, which they claim was out of control, but yet which the photos and videos show that it was quite diminished at the time of the collapse, with thick black smoke indicating that it was oxygen starved.
Mm-hmm. And were the Twin Towers also, does the official report also say that these towers fell at free fall speed at all?
The Twin Towers fell at 2/3 of free fall acceleration, and that is it's still these are accelerating straight down through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance. In other words, there should have, if there's any kind of a collapse, you'd expect it to meet the cold hard steel below the fires and come to a hesitate and come to a stop and maybe possibly fall off the building. We would expect that rather than a continuing accelerating faster and faster and faster with each second, uh, straight down through the path of greatest resistance. That makes no sense at all. It should not have accelerated through that cold, hard, intact steel below. If you look at the construction pictures, you can see that there's a whole lot more steel on the exterior of this building than there is area of glass. It is 14-inch square steel tube columns marching all the way around the perimeter of this building every 3 feet and 4 inches.
Mm-hmm. And there's this pancake theory of the floors collapsing on top of one another, and it would seem that just with their general analysis, that should be slowing it down. The more material that you have gathered up, the you would think that the slower it would go rather than the faster.
Yeah, yeah, and further, NIST says that the portion of buildings, in the case of the North Tower, 15 stories above the point of the jet plane impacts, that it drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. Well, none of the videos show that, A, and B, it completely violates the laws of physics to have the lightest part of a structure destroy the heavier intact steel that gets heavy, that's almost solid steel at the very bottom, and the lightest part is like the steel is only 3/8 inch thick at the very top. So that doesn't make any sense either, and the videos don't even show that. What they show is that in the first 4 seconds its structure is basically being liquefied, if you will. It's telescoping in on itself. It's gone in the first 4 seconds, just like with a Volkswagen runs into a Mack truck. It's going to be, well, it just disappears. And then after that, what we see is these freely flying structural steel sections weighing 4 and 8 tons ejected laterally out of the towers at 80 miles an hour, clocked by physicists, and
Mm-hmm.
landing 600 feet in every direction. So outside the footprint of the building, all the way down the building, such that at the bottom, you only see a 2-story pile of steel. Well, if the steel is not crushing the building, then what is crushing the building? What's left to crush the building at any speed? It's not the steel. It's in a 1,400-foot diameter uh, mess all the way around each of these towers. And so, what about? Oh, maybe it's the concrete, but it's not that either. We'd expect there's 110 stories in each of these buildings. Each of them are an acre in size. So we'd expect to see, 100 pancakes at the bottom of these buildings. Well, we don't
Hmm.
see 50. We don't see 10. We don't even see one. The
Yeah.
concrete is being pulverized in midair. And as we talked about already, laid 3 inches thick in a blanket from river to river. So the concrete is outside the footprint as well outside the footprint. So we're talking 90,000 tons of concrete pulverized in midair. It's not contributing to the collapse either. So what
Hmm.
crushed the building? It's not the steel and the concrete. That's most of the weight of this building.
Yeah. This is a weird little fact I'd like to ask you about, but I always thought it was odd. Um, we're told that one of the passports of one of the hijackers somehow uh, must have flown out of the plane and landed in the rubble. Uh, as a scientist, what is your opinion on the physical possibility of that claim?
I'm sorry, we had an internet glitch there. What claim?
Uh, we're told that one of the passports of the 9/11 hijackers
Oh.
somehow like came out of the plane and landed in the rubble perfectly intact. Um,
Well, I don't comment on that um, suspiciously because there was millions of pieces of paper that landed on the ground intact.
mm,
Maybe they weren't in the plane. Okay. Um, uh, so, but was every piece of paper and passport destroyed in the plane impact? Probably, but I don't know.
okay.
There's a lot of planted evidence and evidence that was said to have not been found that actually was reported to have been found as well, such as the black boxes from both of these planes that impacted the towers. There is a book that has a quote from one of the guys who said he was driving the FBI agents around and they found both of them.
Hmm. Hmm.
And he's got a name. I don't remember his name, but black boxes found at World Trade Center would be a good search for additional information on that. Of course, this was denied by the FBI and everybody else in power.
Interesting. Um, for other recent news, the New York fire commissioners and some first responders have called for a new investigation. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the city of Franklin Square has 5 fire commissioners who have voted unanimously demanding a new investigation of 9/11 based on the evidence we're talking about today, which they were inspired by the fact that this evidence had been submitted by the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 inquiry to the U.S. Attorney in southern Manhattan, and demanding in this petition a new grand jury investigation, a grand jury investigation. So uh, the, that's huge news. This is the first elected body to demand a new investigation. And firefighters in this New York town near Queens uh, are really adamant that this information get out to other fire districts as well. So right now we have the possibility that the entire county that they're in will vote for a similar resolution composed of
Hmm.
50 fire districts. So, and then the state of New York as after that on their radar. So we took Christopher Joya down to Washington, D.C. with us, and he led a press conference on the morning of September 11th, announcing his campaign justice for 9/11 heroes, and that was very powerful. I followed him with the announcement of the Halsey study that had been released, proving that Building 7 couldn't have come down by fire. And Dave Meiswinkle discussed the legal actions that the Lawyers Committee are taking. And Bob McIlvaine, father of Bobby McIlvaine, who lost his life in the North Tower uh, with explosions, gave a moving plea for the investigation to occur in Congress with the Bobby McIlvaine Act, draft legislation that can be introduced in either house of Congress. So we had quite a time after that press conference in Congress with 17 appointments, taking this uniformed fire commissioner to speak to these aides and to these congresspersons. It was a very powerful afternoon. And in addition to that, volunteers from DC 9/11 Truth provided 535 packets to every congressperson's office.
Excellent. Did you find the politicians and aides that you did get to speak to, were they being receptive to the message?
Some of them were, and some of them weren't. Last year, or 2 years ago, I'd gotten basically kicked out of an office because the guy was so angry. You know, he was a vet. But this year was very different. I talked to Steve King from Iowa, who was fascinated by the evidence and who was asking really good questions about the thermite and the nanothermite that we found. We being a team of 8 scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen. He was fascinated, Steve King, Republican, with this evidence, because what's found in all the dust samples is these red-gray chips. They thought they were paint, but they do analysis, which is documented now in a 25-page peer-reviewed paper. They find that it's nanothermite, a very special form of thermite, built extremely small at the nanoscale, 1,000 times smaller in the diameter of a human hair. These particles of iron oxide and aluminum powder set in a bed of oxygen, silica, carbon, organic material, which means this is an incendiary that's engineered to become more explosive. So what's that doing in all the World Trade Center dust samples? By the way, when they put it in a heater in their lab, a differential scanning calorimeter, it ignites, producing much more energy. So it's an energetic material like thermite. A, and B, it releases molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature that the molten iron microspheres found by the U.S. Geological Survey in their samples. So we know where those came from. There's no question they came from all of this nanothermite, which, by the way, but through extrapolation amounts to about 10 tons of this material too. So you got 10 tons of evidence of ignited nanothermite in these iron microspheres, and then you have evidence of 10 tons of unignited thermite. So there must have been a whole lot more that did ignite, in other words. So this is repeatable evidence that's self-corroborating that could be introduced into a court of law or a grand jury investigation, and this is exactly what we gave them, the grand jury.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, it's great to hear about more progress in getting like the politicians and the people that we really need to hear about this in the fight for justice. We really need everyone on board with understanding what truly happened on that day. And I'd like to ask you, we just got a few minutes left here, but I'd like to ask you, when you talk about this sort of stuff with people, often they don't even want to listen off the bat. The fact that you're even bringing this type of stuff up, do you find that, is there any one fact or thing you like to focus on to try to get that helps you open people up to more conversation?
I start with building 7 because building 7 does not have the set of baggage that others have. The evidence is just so so clear. It's irrefutable. Building dropping straight down into its own footprint at free fall in the exact manner of the old hotels in Las Vegas, for instance. Uh, People just open their minds. So yes, that's what I start with.
Mm-hmm. And my last question for you is just, how do you think that we should all respond to this vast lie that we've been told about 9/11? And how can the everyday person respond to all of this? What should we do?
Well, most people respond with a shock, like I did in the beginning, which kind of turned to anger, which turned to action. And so, if people are listening to this and they're not inspired to learn more, well, then I'd suggest that you just go back to sleep and pretend that you're living in a fairy tale. Um, but if it bothers you like does the rest of us, then get informed. Go on our website, ae911truth.org, and look through the materials and the videos there. Look at our video free on YouTube, 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. Or get the videos in our online store with 100 brochures and start passing them out to your friends. And it's saying, look, 3,000 architects and engineers are demanding a new investigation. If 3,000 architects and engineers signed a statement telling you that your house was in danger of collapse, would you listen to them? Okay, well, listen to these guys. We're telling the truth. And we want you to tell others the truth as well. It hurts, but it'll do us a whole lot of good. And it's the only way real healing will ever come to us and the victims of 9/11 and their families.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Richard. It has been great talking to you. I really appreciate all that you've done over the years, just continuing to fight for truth and justice in this extremely important matter. So thank you so much for coming on the show, and keep up the good work.
Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate it. I will, I promise.
All right, everybody. You have a great day. And on Thursday, we'll be having another episode of the podcast with Primal Edge Health. Tristan is coming on the show on Thursday. So look forward to that. And we'll see you all next time. Have a great day.